The deck launches. Power helps. Some previous deck boss had chalked that line at the top of the deck office's ancient slate board decades ago, and every boss since had preserved it, renewing the chalk when it faded, the way you maintain a lighthouse. Senior Chief Vela Moreau kept the board for planning spots because, she said, chalk works when everything else is having a bad day. Junior handlers assumed the line was a joke about the catapult officer's ego. Old hands knew it was doctrine from the ancient days of angled decks and oceans and assumed it would never be operational again, the way you assume things about lighthouses. Aboard a fleet carrier, the air wing gets the glory and the reactor gets the respect. But the ship actually runs on a third authority that outranks both in every way that is never written down. On the carrier Perseus, that authority was Moreau, her title was Deck Boss, and flag officers had been known to wait until she was finished. The flight deck of a carrier is the most dangerous industrial environment human beings have ever chosen to work in daily. A choreography of 100-ton machines, explosive ordnance, cryogenic fuel, and catapults that threw fighters off the prow with the violence of a collision run backward, all of it conducted at combat tempo by crews whose average age would alarm any insurance actuary. Moreau had ruled that choreography for 11 years. Her yellow-shirted handlers moved 60 fighters through launch cycles the way a great kitchen plates a banquet. Her standards were legend, and her sermons were shorter than her standards. The Perseus and her battle group were 19 days into escort duty along the Meridian convoy route, 11,000 civilians and war cargo in 40 hulls behind them, when the fleet's newest nightmare, the weapon the intelligence summaries called the Hush and rated unconfirmed, confirmed itself. The rumors had been circulating for 2 months, in the way of fleet rumors, ahead of and more accurate than the official summaries. Task groups on the far routes reporting contact with Ilek raiders, then reporting a system-wide power event, then not reporting. Survivors' accounts that agreed on one impossible detail. Everything died at once. Not damage, not overload. Death of the grid itself, reactor safeties tripping into deep shutdown, distribution buses inert, a warship converted in 1 silent second into unpowered architecture. Fleet Engineering's reconstruction, circulated under classifications that everyone aboard had somehow seen anyway, theorized a field weapon that induced simultaneous quench in every fusion bottle and superconducting bus inside its radius, the Hush. Estimated restart time for a capital ship's grid after full quench, given intact hardware and a competent crew, 4 hours. Estimated survival time of a carrier group's unpowered ships in contested space, the summaries declined to print, 1. The Ilek sprang the trap at 14:22 fleet time, in the empty light hours between convoy waypoints, and they sprang it correctly, which is to say they spent it on the high-value unit. The raider force showed itself first at extreme range, 11 fast hulls, angling in a feint at the convoy body, and the battle group answered by the book, escorts wheeling out to form the gun line, the Perseus coming to launch heading, first fighter wave rising on the catapults. 14 fighters were airborne when the Ilek pivot ship, a hull the recognition library had flagged for weeks as anomalous, stopped feinting and lit the weapon. The Hush took the Perseus at 14:31. Every survivor describes the same sensation, not an impact, but a subtraction. The catapult tracks hum, the ventilation's breath, the deck lighting, the gravity spin section's deep rotation note, the entire orchestral background of a living ship gone between one heartbeat and the next, and then a silence so total that people heard, for the first time in their tours, the small tick of the hull's skin adjusting to shadow. The fleet's newest nightmare had chosen its victim with doctrine's own logic. The carrier was the battle group's sword. 46 fighters were still aboard her. And outside, visible through the dead deck's open forward doors as drifting sparks, the escorts, outside the field's radius, turned to hold 11 raiders away from a blind giant, outnumbered nearly 2-1, with 1 hour of that arithmetic in them at best. The Perseus's emergency organization functioned exactly as drilled, battery lanterns bloomed, watch stations reported by sound-powered phone, the reactor department began the long liturgy of a cold restart. Captain Anand Rao, on a bridge-lit chem-light green, assembled his situation in 9 minutes, and it assembled bleakly. Grid restart, 4 hours, and his engineers promising nothing sooner. Escort line, engaged, outnumbered, and, on last plot before the sensors died, being methodically flanked. 14 fighters already launched, fighting over the escorts, unrecoverable, 1 tank of fuel each. The Ilek raiders pattern from the far routes, now horribly legible, pin the escorts, spend an hour attriting them, then take the silent carrier at leisure, by boarding if the summaries were right, because a carrier's hull and wing, captured intact, were worth more than her wreck. 4 hours of helplessness against a plan that needed only 2. The sound-powered phone from the hangar deck buzzed at minute 11, and the bridge talker reported that the deck boss was requesting the captain, in person, at her slateboard, and that she had said, quote, "Tell him to bring the ship's attitude thruster inventory," unquote. Rao went. Flag officers had been known to wait, captains could walk. What Vela Moreau had chalked, in 11 minutes, in the dark, was an inventory of everything aboard the Perseus that had never heard of the power grid. Hands 2,900, idle. Cargo dollies, chainfalls and deck winches, manual, rated, numerous. Bay doors, hand crankable by dockyard procedure, slow but certain. Emergency pneumatics, charged, independent, dumb as stone. The ship's chemical attitude thrusters, pressure-fed, self-contained, fireable on battery solenoids, indifferent to the grid's opinion. And 46 fighters whose own compact reactors, isolated in hardened stowage exactly per cold storage doctrine, had ridden out the quench sealed, and would light on internal command the moment anyone could get them off the ship. The problem, she told her captain, chalk still in hand, is not power. The ship has plenty of power. It is wearing yellow shirts and standing around. The problem is that everyone upstairs believes launching is something catapults do. She tapped the old line at the top of the slate, the lighthouse line, and gave Rao the whole proposal in its shadow, in 1 sentence. "Sir," she said, "the deck launches, power helps, and today it can help by staying out of the way." The plan that went into the Perseus's log at minute 19, under Rao's signature and the title Manual Flight Operations, looked like something recovered from a museum, because half of it was. Phase 1 was opening the ship. The main bay doors, 4 of them, were built with dockyard hand-cranked trains for maintenance in unpowered yards, 9,200 turns each, the manual warned, per door. Moreau put 40 hands on each crank train in relay teams of 8 2-minute shifts, called by chant, and the great doors began to walk open at the speed of prayer, while the rest of the deck division worked in the widening slice of starlight. Phase 2 was moving the wing. 60 fighters, 100 tons each, in a hangar without tractors, elevators, or gravity spin, and here the darkness became, unexpectedly, an ally. With the spin sections quenched, the hangar was in freefall, and 100 tons in freefall is not heavy, only stubborn. Moreau's handlers, wearing every mag boot aboard, rigged the hangar into a bucket brigade for aircraft, chainfalls and cargo winches, walking each fighter hand over hand down transit lines laid in chalk and chemlight, human beings hauling warplanes like canalmen hauling barges, and the old hands teaching the young ones, mid-haul, the free-fall load handling that had not been fleet curriculum in 40 years. Phase 3 was fuel and arms, gravity's job given back to muscle, hand pumps rated for emergency defueling, run in reverse by relays, ordnance moved on manual dollies with the fuses carried separately in canvas satchels, each satchel signed for in pencil. And Phase 4, chalked by Moreau on the slate in a diagram that the fleet's engineering school now keeps under glass, was the launch itself. No catapults. Instead, the emergency pneumatic rams, unbolted from their crash barricade mountings and re-rigged at the bay thresholds as one-shot shovers to push each fighter out of the ship at walking pace. Walking pace was survivable but useless in battle. So the diagram's second element supplied the velocity, the Perseus herself, swung by her chemical attitude, thrusters in a slow, continuous roll, converting the whole ship into a sling. Fighters would leave the bays on the roll's outboard side, thrown clear by the carrier's own rotation, lighting reactors and engines only once clear of the hull. An hour earlier, it would have sounded like satire. At minute 19, Rao signed it and added the line the log is famous for. "Approved in full," he wrote. "The deck launches. Bridge will steer the sling." The hour that followed was the strangest labor in the carrier's log, and the log had trouble with it, because logs are built for events, and this was closer to a barn raising conducted inside a held breath. Word of the plan moved through the dark ship by phone and by runner, and the Perseus reorganized herself around it with a speed that no drill had ever produced, because no drill had ever carried these stakes. Off-watch reactor technicians appeared at the door crank stations and joined the relay chants. The galley division, unable to cook, rigged water and ration points along the Chorb transit lines at exactly the spacing of a work gang's thirst, unasked. The ship's chaplain was found on Crank Team 3, pulling his 2-minute shifts in rotation, and when Moreau suggested his talents might be needed elsewhere, replied, in the exchange the crew still quotes, that they were being applied at their maximum effective range and kept cranking. Captain Rao spoke to the ship once in that hour, by the sound-powered circuit, relayed compartment to compartment by talkers repeating his sentences in the dark, which gave the address. Survivors said, "The quality of a story being passed down generations at speed." He did not soften the picture. The escorts were fighting alone, the grid was 3 hours away, and the only combat power the Perseus possessed was presently being moved by hand, in the dark, by them. He ended with the sentence the talkers repeated down through the decks like a wave going ashore, and which the ship's company later voted onto the cruise book's cover. "They took our power," he said. "They left our people. That was their mistake." Continue. At the thresholds, the pneumatic gunners drilled their invented drill. In the bays, the bucket brigade walked its 100-ton barges nose to tail. And on the slateboard, under the lighthouse line, the count of ready fighters climbed in chalk strokes, 5, then 9, then 14, each stroke drawn by whoever was passing, until Moreau posted a handler at the board full-time. Because the strokes had begun arriving faster than the work parties could report them honestly, and the boss did not permit optimism on her slate. Only inventory. The escorts bought the deck its hour, and the price is recorded plainly. The destroyer Halberd lost with 1/3 of her crew, the cruiser Ostrava burning along her flank and firing through it, the 14 orphaned fighters flying on fumes and refusing every order to conserve themselves. The escort commander's transmissions, logged aboard 3 ships, never once asked when the carrier might help. He had seen the Hush take her. He was not waiting for the dead. At minute 63, on the Perseus's deck, the first fighter reached the number 2 bay threshold. There was no ceremony and no light beyond chemsticks. The pilot, sealed and breathing tank air, was walked to the threshold by handlers on lines like a ship being warped out of harbor. The pneumatic ram's gunner, a 19-year-old aviation apprentice whose entire relevant training was 6 drills invented that hour, watched Moreau's hand, and Moreau watched the bridge's count, passed by sound-powered phone, as the great ship's slow chemical roll walked the bay's mouth around toward the outboard of the sling. The count reached mark. Moreau's hand fell. The ram fired with a cough of stored air, and 100 tons of folded violence slid out of the dark ship at a fast walk, dropped away on the rotation, and fell clear of the hull, tumbling gently, a leaf leaving a turning tree. 4 seconds later, at safe separation, the fighter's reactor lit. Then its engines. Then its running lights, deliberately, insolently bright, and the deck crews watching from the threshold in the dark sent up a sound that the sound-powered phones carried to every compartment of the ship, and that the sailors of the Perseus for the rest of their lives at reunions would describe the same way, not a cheer. Bigger. The sound a crew makes learning that its ship is not, after all, going to die today. The bridge log entry is Terra and is the one the Academy teaches. Minute 67. It reads, "First fighter away, manual launch, ship roll method. Interval 2 next, 4 minutes and falling. The deck is launching." They launched 46 fighters in 3 hours and 11 minutes off a dead ship by hand, and the tempo told its own story of a deck division finding its rhythm in the dark. The first 6 launches took 4 minutes each. Then Moreau's handlers began to shave the choreography. Transit lines doubled, so fighters queued at the thresholds, nose to tail. Ram recharging crews found 9 seconds in the valve sequence. The bridge's thruster team, burning attitude propellant against a budget, Rao recalculated every quarter hour, learned to hold the roll rate steady enough that the launch marks came like a metronome. By the second hour, the interval was 90 seconds, 3 bays working in stagger, and the Perseus was performing, in freefall and total darkness, the choreography that had made her deck famous under full power, and performing it to chant and chalk and hand signal, the whole enormous silent hangar moving like a single patient animal. The costs were paid in the coin decks, always pay, sprains, crush injuries taken by handlers putting bodies between drifting tons and other people, one broken shoulder belonging to a chief who finished her shift before reporting it. The sound-powered phones carried the Escorts' war into the hangar between launch counts, unfiltered, and the deck warped to it. The Ostrava's fires, the Halberd's last transmission, the orphaned 14 calling their fuel states down in cold percentages. And then, at minute 111, the phones carried something else. The first hand-launched wave, 20 fighters under the wing commander, arriving over the escort line. The Ilek Raider force had built its entire engagement, its timing, its fuel, its nerve, on the doctrine that a hushed carrier was a solved problem, a prize drifting toward the second half of their plan. The wave that fell on their flanking element came, as far as their tactical picture could determine, from nowhere. Fighters, fresh, armed and angry, radiating from a hull their instruments still rated dead. The rumors of what humans did in the dark had not yet reached the Ilek, because the humans who did things in the dark had, until that afternoon, always died with the secret. Not this afternoon. The flanking element lost 3 hulls in 11 minutes, and the arithmetic strangling the escort line reversed so fast that the Ostrava's gunnery officer, tracking the change, lobbed a line that the cruiser's crest now carries in bronze. Sky full of hours, it reads. Source, apparently the afterlife. Adjusting fire with pleasure. The Ilek commander was competent, and competence, confronted with the impossible, checks its assumptions before its courage. His force disengaged the escorts, reformed with discipline, and did the correct thing. If the carrier could somehow launch, the carrier was still the battle, and he took his remaining hulls in hard toward the Perseus to finish the anomaly at its source, betting that whatever miracle was throwing fighters off a dead ship could not also defend one. He was right about the ship. He was wrong about what the deck had been doing with its spare minutes. Moreau's third-hour launches had not gone to the escort line. On the wing commander's plot and Rao's order, waves 3 and 4, 22 fighters, had gone dark themselves the moment they cleared the sling, reactors at idle, engines cold, drifting on launch momentum into a scattered shell around their mothership, an ambush seeded by hand around the very silence the enemy was steering for. The Perseus, drifting, powerless, apparently helpless, hung at the center of her own wing-like bait that had already been switched. The Ilek attack run entered the shell at minute 198. 22 reactors lit at once, at ranges the fleet's fighter tactics manuals, before that day classed as unachievable except by accident. What followed was less a dogfight than the collapse of a plan. Raiders built for slashing runs against warships, caught decelerating in close by fighters they had classified as expended, with the fresh half of the human wing arriving from the escort line behind them. The Ilek pivot ship, the Hush carrier itself, the anomalous hull that had silenced fleets and never once been touched, was killed inside the first 3 minutes by pilots who had been specifically, personally briefed on which silhouette had put their ship in the dark. The remainder broke and ran for deep space, and Rao, on a bridge still lit chem-light green, declined pursuit, because his fighter's fuel margins were already written on a slate 3 decks below him, in chalk, in a hand nobody aboard argued with. The battle group's after-action summary compressed the day into one sentence that fleet historians have never managed to improve. The enemy silenced the carrier, and the carrier's crew declined to consider this relevant. There remained the small matter, at hour 4 of landing 43 surviving fighters on a ship that still had no power, and if the launches made the legend, the recoveries made the profession quietly proudest, because landing is always harder. The deck division rigged the recovery bays with every barricade net aboard, retensioned by chainfall to Moreau's arithmetic, and the pilots came home in the reverse of their leaving, approach at crawl, matched to the carrier's steady drift, gliding deadstick into nets in a dark bay guided by handlers wielding chemlight wands in the old signals, some of which had to be reinvented on the spot and voted on by phone between bays. 43 fighters trapped safe. 11 nets needed replacing. One pilot, asked by the debriefers to characterize a manual net recovery aboard an unpowered carrier, gave the answer that hangs framed in the Perseus's ready room: "It is like being caught by your whole family at once, and I recommend it over the alternative." The grid came back at hour 4 and 51 minutes, reactor department exactly on its promised liturgy, and the ship's lights rising deck by deck were greeted, witnesses report, with a strange brief disappointment. The way daylight ends, a night everyone knows they will tell stories about forever. The escorts limped in alongside. The halberd survivors were berthed by deck division petition in the deck division's own spaces. The convoy, 40 hulls and 11,000 souls, passed its waypoint on schedule, most of its passengers never knowing the afternoon had happened, which the battle group agreed was the correct shape of a victory. And in the deck office, before she slept, Vela Moreau took the chalk and performed the only edit any boss has ever made to the lighthouse line. She did not erase it. Beneath the deck launches. Power. Helps. In her own square hand, she added the day's finding and initialed it, and the two lines have been maintained together ever since, renewed chalk stroke by chalk stroke on a slate board that flag officers are still known to wait beside. Confirmed. The second line reads, VM. The fleet, presented with the Perseus's after-action report, did what good institutions do with miracles. It refused to leave it one. Within a year, manual flight operations was a certified fleet capability with a syllabus, a school, and an inspection standard. Every carrier in the human navy now carries pneumatic launch rams as fitted equipment, drills the ship roll sling under instructors with Perseus lineage, and maintains what the regulations call, in official language nobody uses, grid-independent flight operations readiness. The fleet uses the sailor's name for it, because the sailor's name, 1. Dark Deck. Dark Deck drills are run quarterly, in freefall, by chant and chalk and hand signal, and the standing joke that they are the only drills sailors volunteer for extra sessions of has the distinction of being true. The Hush, its carrier hull dissected and its physics finally understood, was countered within 2 years by quenched hardened bus designs and faded from the war. The doctrine it taught did not fade. The lesson of the Meridian route, as the Academy frames it, was never about one weapon. It was that humanity's ships carry 2 power systems, and the enemy's weapon had silenced only the one that hums. Every navy designs for the grid. The human navy, after the Perseus, formally designs for the other one, and the design requirement is written into the naval architecture standards under a clause titled, "By somebody with institutional courage, crew as installed power." Vela Moreau served 9 more years, refused a warrant commission 4 times, and retired as the most decorated deck sailor in fleet history, directly into a senior instructor's billet at the Dark Deck School, which had been made a condition, in writing, of her retirement paperwork by the fleet. The original slate board went to the Fleet Museum over her objection and the deck division's formal protest, and the compromise stands to this day. The museum holds the slate, and the Perseus's deck office holds a new one, on which the first thing chalked, by Moreau's own hand at the transfer ceremony, was both lines renewed. The museum plaque beneath the old slate says, "Everything the fleet knows how to say about that afternoon on the Meridian route," and it does it in the service's plainest voice. The enemy calculated 4 hours of silence, it reads. The deck required 67 minutes. Visitors are reminded that the chalk is original and that the doctrine remains in force. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new one leaves Earth every day.